Hey everyone, and welcome. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because we are unpacking a truly unique explainer. We're going to be diving into a sprawling, epic narrative all about survival, identity, and total transformation. And when I say sprawling, I mean we're covering centuries of history here. We'll be exploring how a very specific region went from its indigenous roots and ambitious colonial projects through some incredibly devastating wars straight into the absolute maze of modern geopolitics. It's quite the ride, so let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll hit early colonies and indigenous roots, then move into revolution, war, and reconstruction. After that, we'll explore civil rights and cultural shifts, pivot into the Soviet economic transformation, and wrap it all up with independence and modern geopolitics. Starting right off with Section 1, Early Colonies and Indigenous Roots. So Georgia's earliest days, they were essentially an ambitious project born out of social reform and military strategy. We're not talking about some accidental, haphazard settlement here. It was a highly planned buffer zone and honestly a beacon of hope for folks in deep debt. Let's wind the clock back to trace how this happened. In 1540, you have the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto marching across the territory. But the real structural beginning, the true foundation, happens in 1732. That's when King George II grants a charter to James Oglethorpe, who is this visionary social reformer. Literally just a year later, in 1733, General Oglethorpe arrives with 135 English settlers and founds Savannah. These rapid-fire pivotal dates are absolutely crucial because they establish the colony not just as a new home, but as a deliberate, fortified military barrier against Spanish Florida right to the south. Now, you might be wondering about the contrasting realities on the ground at this time. It's actually fascinating. On one side, you've got these English colonists seeking a safe haven from overcrowded, miserable debtors' prisons back in England, and remarkably, the colony actually started out by banning both slavery and rum. Can you imagine? On the other side, you have the indigenous Creeks, specifically the established Yamacraw tribes, who are suddenly handling this new encroachment and navigating early diplomatic treaties. Led by figures like Tamachichi, there was initially this genuine goodwill and respectful diplomacy between Oglethorpe and Native American leaders. It stood in stark contrast to the violent conquests we usually see in other colonies of that era. To really get a feel for this, think about Mary Musgrove. She was a wealthy, mixed-blood Creole woman who owned and operated a tavern on the Ogeechee River. And for almost a decade, she was the primary negotiator acting on behalf of the Creeks with British colonial leaders. I just love bringing her up because she perfectly embodies the incredibly complex, intertribal nature of colonial survival and identity. She wielded immense wealth and power, which really just goes to show us that early Georgia was a deeply intertwined, multicultural frontier. It wasn't black and white. Moving right along to Section 2, Revolution, War, and Reconstruction. Well, that initial frontier stability, yeah, it definitely didn't last. We're transitioning now into an era of brutal conflict, where Georgia's civil structures were repeatedly destroyed, rebuilt, and tested to their absolute breaking point. The Revolutionary War threw the entire region into absolute chaos. Royal Governor James Wright was literally forced to flee in 1776. The British eventually captured major cities like Savannah and Augusta, which forced the rebels to ditch traditional sieges and pivot to grueling hit-and-run guerrilla warfare. During this time, the constant, chaotic power shifts meant regular citizens had to prioritize pure survival over lofty ideological principles. Your allegiances kind of had to shift based on who held your town that particular day. Yet, somehow, amidst all that chaos, they still managed to draft a state constitution in 1777. Fast forward through a few decades of growth, and we hit another devastating wall. December 13th, 1864. On this specific day, General William T. Sherman occupied Savannah. This date marked the end of his infamous March to the Sea, a campaign of just immense physical and social destruction that permanently, fundamentally altered the landscape of the Old South. The old economic and social systems were completely and irreparably shattered. Rebuilding from that took a massive paradigm shift. To put that recovery into perspective, let's jump to the modern era for a second. If you look at the 2008 to 2009 fiscal year, Georgia Southern University pumped over $700 million into the regional economy, along with $20 million in capital expenditures. That is a massive regional impact. It just goes to show how deeply intertwined educational institutions became with post-Reconstruction regional economic recovery, supporting thousands of jobs. It's a complete transformation from a devastated agricultural landscape to an economy heavily driven by education and modern capital. All right, Section 3, Civil Rights and Cultural Shifts.
Going into the mid-20th century, Georgia became the absolute frontier for the fight for equality. Let's walk through these rapidly escalating cultural shifts chronologically because the momentum is staggering. In April 1960, brave students at Fort Valley State College started staging sit-ins. And the momentum didn't stop there. By May 1961, the Atlanta student movement had organized thousands to march against segregated accommodations. The pressure just kept building and building, and by July 1964, the sheer frustration finally culminated in explosive civil unrest down in Southside Atlanta. These weren't just isolated historical blips, they were a sustained, undeniable pressure campaign that absolutely forced downtown businesses and politicians to the negotiating table, fundamentally altering the state's social fabric.
But while these vital political battles were raging, there was also this massive explosion of cultural contributions, simultaneously cementing a national legacy. We're talking a huge growth in mountain folk crafts and the visual arts, really highlighted by the 1948 opening of the Georgia Museum of Art. And musically, grassroots string bands and jug bands were blowing up. Atlanta even hosted the country's very first commercial recording, way back in 1917. This incredibly robust cultural foundation became an indelible part of the region's search for a new, defining voice. But what about the transition from state planning to a market economy? Section 4. The Soviet Economic Transformation. Yup. Welcome to the Eurasian narrative of our explainer. We are now exploring the Republic of Georgia, where the struggle for identity shifts entirely from civil rights in the American South to escaping the crushing weight of universal Soviet industrial production over in the Caucasus. So the crucial point here is understanding how this system actually functioned. During the Soviet era, Georgia's economy was dictated entirely by Gosplan, the Central Planning Institute based all the way in Moscow. And get this, Gosplan directed the economy literally by hand, using mathematical instruments to manage input-output balances completely blindly. They totally ignored local capabilities, basically forcing Georgia into an agricultural duality that stripped away all of its local autonomy. So what did this look like on the ground? Well, this complete loss of local economic control meant the nation was reduced to producing just a few specific items: grapes, tea, citrus, and mineral waters. That's it. Local bureaucrats in Georgia were left totally powerless, often taking the fall for inefficient central systems that they had literally zero control over. The economy was universally unified with the massive USSR machine, but at the absolute cost of Georgia's own production potential. Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 5, Independence and Modern Geopolitics. So following the total disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, Georgia finally regained its independence. And that kicked off a highly turbulent, progressive journey toward Western modernization. A massive pivot happens in 2003, when Mikhail Saakashvili leads a bloodless revolution. He pushes aggressively for Western-style modernization, navigating the Adjara invasion in 2004. His whole goal was to rapidly untangle the country from Russian influence, and you can see that trajectory leading all the way to 2020, where Georgia actually hosted NATO partnership training exercises. It is a really incredible story of a nation actively fighting to redefine its geopolitical alignment on the world stage. And woven into all this crazy political evolution is just immense cultural diversity. While Georgians make up the 83% majority as the titular state builders, you also have Armenians and Azerbaijanis in regions like Marnuli and Akhalkalaki who have literally placed a watermark on the nation through high mountain architecture and Islamic aesthetic elements. Then you have Ossetians and Abkhazians near the administrative boundary lines who have preserved ancient healing mineral pools and medieval palaces. Every single one of these groups has profoundly shaped the physical, art, and architecture of the country we see today. However, the fight for transparency and civic development continues to face some pretty heavy headwinds today. Despite achieving some really significant constitutional reforms and democratic strides, the modern nation is dealing with deep political polarization. Recent years have seen escalating public unrest over controversial measures like the non-commercial legal entity bill, alongside various media crackdowns. And these hurdles matter deeply because they are the crucial defining tests for any emerging democracy striving to secure its place globally. The path to a fully open, Western-aligned democracy remains incredibly turbulent. Which brings us to our final, somewhat bizarre, but entirely fascinating conclusion. We have just unpacked the history of a U.S. state born as a buffer colony and a Eurasian nation fighting its way out of the Soviet bloc. Across centuries and continents, what unites the enduring spirit of Georgia in its ongoing fight for survival, identity, and independence? Whether it's surviving colonial sieges or breaking free from central state planning, the drive to define one's own destiny remains remarkably, powerfully the same. I really hope this explainer gave you a uniquely structured look at both of these incredible histories. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we will see you next time.